fucking do this. Boom. Okay. So, hopefully everybody can hear me. If you cannot hear me, I feel bad. But I'm going to do the whole thing anyway, and we'll work from there. So I wanted to talk about, I usually do like a weekly roundup, but these days a week is like 1 day long. So let's just talk about today. And I want to what it feels like for a lot of people in cyber policy that we are just spinning in circles and nothing is changing. That's okay. I want to point out that we as a society are sometimes really bad at just addressing any issues. So historically, if you start looking at even history that's fairly 50 years ago, sometimes it sounds exactly like the history in the New York Times or a reputable newspaper today. For example, in this particular thing on Wikipedia, my 11-year-old was doing a project on Malcolm X for his class. And I'm like, that's funny. This whole thing where a couple cops randomly see a guy, decide to beat him up, and then beat up a witness, and then put them in jail, and then won't let them out and until 500 people show up, 4,000 people show up outside the police station. That sounds like it could be from yesterday, right? They managed to get these two people hospital access, and then the cops decide to put Malcolm X under surveillance. So that sounds like it could be yesterday, right? So let's just let's acknowledge that perhaps the systems we have in place aren't great for fixing problems, right? So Florida's flooded future, right? So we receive a warning. I've lived in Florida for 16 years, and outside my house when I first moved here, it didn't flood. And then it started flooding a little bit. And now it floods anytime it rains, right? So it's not even a long period of time when you try to figure out oh, wow, things are changing. Will we do anything about it? No, the system we have in place, honestly, in South Beach here is oriented toward how do we maximize the profit of hotels. Hotels, they've captured the governance, and that's just how it's going to go. And I think, where does this replicate itself in our space, in the space of cyber war? Well, software companies have captured the governance processes around them pretty much the whole time, and that's just the way it is. In the sense of you get in while the getting's good and you get out while the getting's bad. I actually live in a historical district, which in America is hilarious. And I'm always like, who are we saving these houses for? Aquaman? Because that's literally the only person who's going to be able to appreciate the architecture of our underwater habitat. So I enjoy watching that, we think our area is uniquely failing, but I just think it's just failing like everything else is failing. So let's just accept that and enjoy it. And so Chris Krebs, I think, asked a really good question here. He's like, so what do you do now? And if you've been in jiu-jitsu, the standard thing about oh, how do I get out of this armbar is, well, you screwed up a long time ago, right? Just a long time ago. Your arm is in such danger that there's no plan. You don't have a, recovery plan for fixing the fact that your arm is about to get broken. So none of these other things, I don't think, all this stuff, pour one out, right? We have to acknowledge that there's a capacity of incident response and of incident response policy that has been exhausted. It's gone. We have run out, right? Like if there was another pandemic right now, you would have to acknowledge we have run out of capacity to deal with these problems, right? So people like the numbers I've heard dwarf what's reported here. Let me explain to the incident response and just security policy community that mass scan is 100 years old now. I don't know how how old Maskin is, and I should have looked it up before I got on this live stream, but it's super old. So all that is it's a machine that transforms an exploit that works on one machine to an exploit that works on every reachable machine. It's super simple. And so I don't understand why we're only now realizing that this is a sort of way of life. So that confuses me. What I enjoy about all of cyber policy is that there's a very simple transitive process between what I do is responsible and what other people do is irresponsible. I love that. So I just appreciate that as artwork, and I feel like everyone should look for that. And I've been enjoying Ben Hawks's Twitter feed because he sometimes will go back to like a previous thing he sent like a long time ago and point out like, okay, here's the context around that right now, right? So Alex has some thoughts on on state capture, and he's not wrong. Like there's some easy analogies on state capture. The thing is, they're so easy, and yet we just sort of like wish they weren't, so we just ignore them. All right, so I just want to go and we'll talk a little bit about whether or not there's anything new in the world. And I just enjoy this picture of a toddler staring at the ocean. So here's the thing. In the same sense that we've received warnings about global warming and the fact that my house will soon be underwater, we have also received a million warnings about Active Directory, Exchange, SharePoint, all these legacy technical structures. And it's not just the structure of the technology, it's how it fits into the structure of your company and everything that you do with it, right? So I don't know of a good historical way to point out that you can't build your companies the way you used to be building them. I guess a good one is we used to have offices and now we don't have offices. And so like people are realizing that the VPNs they used to have are a bad idea because they just connect networks to networks and you don't have anything to connect to anymore. And so we were sort of fuddling around with that, and now all of a sudden we have to do it, right? So the same thing's true about Active Directory and Exchange. And the first thing I did when my company was bought was I was like, hey, do we have any of this stuff that's we know is bad in the environment? And if so, do we have to hook up to it, right? So these are things, and people have ignored Tim. He's like, oh, I had it as no day, right? Like, who is this guy, right? People are like, we'll just ignore that little tweet. We'll pretend it doesn't exist. So 100 years ago, the Active Directory stuff was starting to get really pounded on by Microsoft researchers. And they were like, look, the system is too complex and you can't secure it, and the way we traverse it is automatable, so we're on the wrong end of all this stuff. The leverage is heavy against us. And then everyone's like, cool, good to know, right? So it's not that we didn't receive the warnings. That's all I'm trying to say. And there's other warnings that we have clearly not understood, which is if someone downloads all of your email all at once, that used to take a while, right? So people talk about dwell time, right? And dwell time used to be like, oh, they were on our network for like a couple days, but we kicked them out, so now they're gone. And I'm like, yeah, they're gone, but they have every email you've ever sent anyone in the organization, the whole thing. And I'm like, does it matter if they're gone? It really doesn't. You know what I mean? They already know everything you know. And so I guess the thing is we've built so many of our response systems around this idea of lateral movement, but what if either it's automated or just not interesting, right? Like, what if you don't do lateral movement? You don't have to because you can suck a network dry and then move out from there. So again, meta warnings. And you hear this from like everybody. These are not my ideas, right? Like the way we buy and use enterprise software is completely broken, and everyone knows it, and they just move on, right? Like the same as people buying condos in Florida right now. They're like, cool, that's awesome. So this is a little bug in F5. It doesn't matter that there's a bug in F5. What matters is that the mechanism of enterprise software is you just make some product sticky. Then you start extracting rent, essentially, by cutting all your costs and just charging the license fee, and you sort of reduce features as well, right? You just keep going. And then you just profit from there. That's how this works. We know how the business model works, and we keep buying into it at the cost of our own systemic risk, right? The systemic risk is not that people know vulnerabilities and, weirdly enough, are able to talk about them on the internet. That's not the systemic risk. The systemic risk is that everything you buy has this business model. So I'm going to move toward my ideas, which are made for people to hate. So one thing is, if a vulnerability in your product or any product that you've bought could destroy your company, then you shouldn't have it having access to the internet. Like, it should be in its own little bubble. And that apparently includes a lot of VPN software that you guys have bought. And in this case, Exchange, right? Like, the reality is patching is not the solution. Someone has sold the entire industry on the idea that patching is a useful thing to do, that it solves their problems. And it's very fun to watch. And I think the other thing we've noticed is that advisories really haven't changed since the 90s, right? Loft came up with this sort of format of the advisory, and most of this process exists to make software vendors' business models continue to work. But that doesn't mean that has to be the way it is. There's a lot of new things you could do. For example, instead of saying this, it would have been cool if Orange Sci had instead said, everyone immediately remove Exchange from the internet. Because, all right, so we have like the confidentiality, integrity, availability triad. And what we do now emphasizes availability over the other two in a huge way. It's like confidentiality and integrity are not even factors. It's purely availability. That's what patching is for, right? Because you keep the thing around while absorbing risks to the other two things, right? So if Orange Sci had wanted to emphasize confidentiality or integrity, then he could have said, everyone immediately remove Exchange from the internet. And after that, it's Microsoft's problem to get you to put it back on the internet. They have to somehow convince you that it's worth putting back on the internet after that. That is what you should have done. MD5s that tell you that you were smart in the past don't help the world, but they do help a certain segment of the world. So I also want to talk about the hilarity that is the fact that we do have no connection. This also is not my idea. No connection of apps and updates with behaviors, right? So people are trying to put a manifest together for software bill of materials, right? Like if I talk to Alan, but I want the analytical queries and data structures from Microsoft that they're using to do all the hunting that give it some baseline, and I want it in a graph when I buy the product. Does anyone else think it's completely backwards that Microsoft sells you a product and then you have to go to them as well with a subscription to get the security angle on that product? That is really weird. That's a very weird thing. It's very profitable, but it's weird for people building companies. And I also think that we talk about deterrence and how deterrence doesn't work. It does work. It's such an annoying conversation in cyber policy. But imagine if Microsoft stopped selling Exchange to Chinese companies just for like a year. Just be like, yeah, we don't support or sell to Chinese companies until you guys change the way your government handles our company, right? Like we thought it was abusive, so we've decided not to sell to you guys. That would be amazing, right? Like they could do that. There's no reason they have to sell to Chinese companies. So they won't do that, but they could, right? Like I also think it's really annoying, and this is just me, that there's like no more, there's no non-heterosexual kissing in Disney movies because all the money comes from China now. Like we all have to live to what the Chinese norms are. And I think we should accept that the Chinese are setting the norms in cyber as well. Because if this can't happen, there's a reason why. So I love that this was dated February 15th. And we know actually that it was, I guess, not the largest and most sophisticated attack. I don't know if you could even count the exchange thing as sophisticated. But nonetheless, deterrence is a possibility. And I think deterrence has to come from people. It does not come necessarily from like a vague government policy. So that's all I had. But I wanted to also say you guys should register and attend to GrimCon. And I'll be heckling talks, and it will be super fun. It's free, and it is, well, this is the old one, I guess, but there's a new one, and it's next week. So that's that. That's all I had. The only correct move is not to play. I don't know if that's even true. Maybe the only correct move is not to take yourself so seriously. So anyways, thanks for spending 15 minutes with me on your Friday. You can now officially, you've done all the thinking you have to do. You can now go play Overwatch. And that's that. Bye, everyone.